Everyone, welcome Roy to the stage and have fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So thanks for joining. As I briefly said, it's actually a lie because GraphQL isn't just HTTP, because it's not. And I will tell you more about why it isn't later on. But first, let me introduce myself a bit more. So my name is Roy. Like I said, I'm from the Netherlands, Amsterdam more specifically. And what I enjoy most is helping developers succeed, building cool products for developers, going to conferences like this one, and also writing a lot of developer content. So maybe one of the books, maybe you've read them, maybe you didn't. And maybe you also saw my talk in 2019 when I was here at ConfrontJS. I believe it was at the museum for airplanes. It was a cool location.
Yes, it was.
So what do you already know about GraphQL? It's a question I usually ask before I start doing my talk. GraphQL is pretty old. It's from like 2015, and it was invented even before that. So sometimes I feel like I'm explaining people about an old technology instead of one of the coolest, latest new things. But luckily, the ecosystem is evolving, and new things are being added to GraphQL every day, so that's good to see. So what do you already know about GraphQL? So maybe you're the left person that says, I know how this works. You probably tried it, maybe in a small project, maybe even in your company, or maybe you just saw a talk at a conference or meetup and you think you know what GraphQL is. Or maybe you're B and you're the curious person and you'd like to know how this works. So if you're B, I would like you to stand up. Unless no one is B. Some people are B. Okay, it's great. So keep standing, please. Not for too long, not for too long. And then who did visit ConfrontJS in 2019? If you didn't, you should also stand up. So if you didn't visit ConfrontJS in 2019, you should also stand up, please. Okay, great. We got quite some people standing. So if you're B, you keep standing, you just keep standing all. So I want you to take out your phone and scan this QR code. So as I said, I was at the conference in 2019. And if you don't know GraphQL or you weren't here, make sure to scan this QR code and also help the organizers a bit. I see they have like 130 subscribers, so make sure to hit that button because what I always like to say, YouTube is a free university. So even when you leave the conference, you can still keep learning at home. So make sure to do this. It won't cost you anything, and I'm Dutch, so I like free stuff. So make sure to use all the free YouTube materials. Yeah, I mean,
Bravo.
Let's help each other. Okay, so you can all sit down now if you want. You can also keep standing. I'm pretty flexible. Thank you. So yeah, like I said, YouTube is a free university, so try to learn. You did the first step by coming to the conference and learning new stuff about JavaScript. So take the second step, and when you're at home, don't stop learning. Just keep learning with all the free materials you can find online. So back to today's topic. Like I said in the beginning, it's GraphQL. Quite a few of you still are wondering what GraphQL is, or maybe how you could use it, or what's the actual magic behind GraphQL. So in the beginning, I said GraphQL is just HTTP. And in some level, this is true, and in a lot of levels, it's not true at all. So let's cross this out, because GraphQL often isn't just HTTP. It's way more than that. But as maybe some of you in here are front-end developers, for you, in most cases, GraphQL actually is HTTP. So if you are interacting with a GraphQL API as a front-end developer, and I don't know how many people here are front-end developers? I like to consider myself front-end mostly. Okay, cool. So if you're using a GraphQL API, what you typically see is just the tip of the iceberg. So you may be interacting with a GraphQL API through HTTP, but you don't see there's all this cool stuff going on underneath. And it's perfectly fine not to know. It's maybe even better not to know because, well, as soon as you know, it's like a magic trick. Once you saw how it works, you maybe don't want to be involved in it anymore. You don't see the magic at all. So let's maybe keep it that way. But in this talk, I'll be showing you some of the magic tricks that you're not seeing by demystifying what GraphQL is, especially for you as a front-end developer. And I always like, so I tweeted this some time ago. Actually, a lot of people got mad at me because it's the same with APIs, right? So it could be a REST API. It could also be a GraphQL API. And all these things that are going on underneath, like I believe T just quickly said it, you maybe have multiple availability zones, you have all these database, all these cache layers. There's lots of stuff going on underneath when you're interacting with an API. And usually as a front-end developer, you just see the tip of the iceberg. And today, I'll be showing you what the tip of the iceberg looks like and maybe give you a small idea of what's underneath. So GraphQL is often accessed using HTTP. So if you are using a GraphQL API in your company, or maybe you're working with a public GraphQL API like the one from GitHub, you just see an HTTP address, usually ends with like GraphQL, and you can send requests to it. And these requests are GraphQL operations. So this could be a query in case you want to get read-only data. It could be mutation if you like to mutate data, or it could also be subscriptions. But if it's subscriptions, you typically don't access this endpoint using HTTP because those are for real-time data. And this is because GraphQL is transport layer agnostic. So in theory, you could serve GraphQL over any sort of transport layer. And most of the times what you're seeing is HTTP. Sometimes you'll see WebSockets like a WS transport because you're using WebSockets for subscriptions. It could be anything else as well. So maybe you can use GraphQL over some sort of RPC layer. There are multiple things you could do. But most of the times you're seeing GraphQL being served just over HTTP. So GraphQL subscriptions is usually the one exception people get. So it's kind of annoying if you're working with a GraphQL API and you want to do subscriptions next to queries and mutations. You typically have two endpoints. So maybe that's a problem we can one day solve. But for now, you're usually using HTTP, and sometimes you have to stick with WebSockets if you want to do real-time data. And like I said, let's demystify some of the magic there is in GraphQL. And I actually like this word, demystifying. It feels a bit like you're revealing something secret and making it a bit less secret. So hopefully that will work out. Do some of you know the TV show Mythbusters? I really enjoyed this when, I don't know even when anymore, but specifically one episode where they were seeing if quicksand actually works. If you stand in a quicksand, you will slowly drown, and the more you push, the harder you will sink. It's one of my favorite episodes. But I'll be using some of this Mythbuster logic to see if we can actually demystify what GraphQL does for you. And the first thing I want to show you is GraphQL playgrounds. So there are multiple ways to interact with a GraphQL API, but usually if you find a new GraphQL API, like the one from GitHub or maybe from the one you built yourself and your backend developers will give you an endpoint to play with, you would see a GraphQL playground. So this could be Graphical, which is the most popular one. It's open sourced and it's part of the GraphQL Foundation. There's also some other ones, but the most popular one is Graphical. So let's see if we can demystify some of the magic that is going on here. Because for a lot of people first looking at GraphQL, the first thing you'll see is a playground like this, which maybe gives you the wrong idea around what GraphQL is because you're seeing this magical playground. And then the second step probably is, how would I connect this playground to my application? Because you can't use a playground in your application if you're just trying to do HTTP requests. So for this, I created a small demo too. Let me go here. Actually, let me go show the toolbar. Let me go here. So this is a graphical playground. It's probably big enough like this. So this is a GraphQL playground, and for most people, it's the first time they encounter GraphQL, they will do it through a playground like this. It looks pretty cool, right? You have documentation for your API, so you can find out what data is available. You can find out what operations there are. You can also see a history of your operations. You can do cool stuff, like there's all sorts of buttons that you don't have in your application when you start playing with this API for maybe a component. And that's something I'll show later on, so don't worry. But this playground, the first time you see it, you probably think it's some sort of magic because you have this funny looking query on the left. There are some curly brackets in there. You don't really know how it works. And then you send a request and you just get a JSON result back. So this is completely different from what you experience the first time you use a REST API. Because maybe you open this REST API in a browser and you just see a blob of JSON. Maybe you open it in some tool like Postman. Or maybe you're just being lazy like me and you do it directly from your component. You do a fetch function and you console log the result. I mean, it's also completely fine. With GraphQL, you typically end up here with a playground, because otherwise you've no clue what you should send to the endpoint. And it becomes more interesting when you start typing stuff here. It's all being auto-completed. You can add descriptions. You can add more information that's available for this GraphQL API. And what you maybe don't know is if you would go to the network tab, you can actually deconstruct what's going on here. So let me do this. Hopefully it's big enough. So whenever I execute a new query, you can actually see an HTTP request being sent. So although it feels like magic, it's just a tool people built that you actually use with this endpoint, the same as Postman is a tool to work with REST APIs. And if you would go here, you can see it's pretty similar to what you would do for a REST API. You would have your request method. And for GraphQL, it's always post, so you don't really do a GET request, you do a POST request instead. Does someone know why? Yes, indeed. So we have this query that's the body that we should send to the API as well, because otherwise the API doesn't know what data we need. Because from the endpoint itself, you don't really know what data you're requesting. You need to append the body to it. That's why we have the POST request. We have some response headers. They don't really matter. We have some request headers. One is actually important. It's the application JSON one, because GraphQL expects you to work with JSON data. If you look at the payload, you can actually find this body, which is just an object. Looks a bit, doesn't look too nice in this. Usually it looks better, but it's fine. So we have a JSON object, and this JSON object has a string, which is our GraphQL query. And then a response is just a blob of JSON again. So even though the tool make it sound magical or make it look magical, the actual request is just HTTP. And whenever you're working with GraphQL, you're not really sure how to bring something from GraphQL to your local component. You can actually just copy-paste this request from the network tab and have it working like this. So that's a nice way to start exploring GraphQL APIs, but to actually work with it, you would need to understand in the end, it's just HTTP that you would use in your application. So I'm just considering this to be demystified. I mean, it looks cool, the graphical playground or whatever playground there is, but in the end, it's just an abstraction layer that helps you to work with the GraphQL APIs. And then another thing I wanted to show you is GraphQL clients, because they usually also feel like magic. You have some code, and suddenly you get information back that you can use in your component. There might even be some state management involved. And as a developer, you have all this synthetic sugar that you not really need. Or maybe you do need it, it makes your life easier. But it also leads to the fact that you don't really know what's going on underneath. So let's have a look at the GraphQL clients. And I'll be using Apollo client for this, but typically you can apply the same way of thinking to any GraphQL client. So again, I prepared a small demo to show you how this works. And we'll be taking several steps actually to show you how the synthetic sugar actually takes away some of the things that are going on underneath. This. And for this I used Code Sandbox, which is a nice tool to run code in your browser. It's specifically useful if you want to share code with other people, like we're doing today. And let me show you some of my workflows on working with GraphQL APIs. So typically I would start at the GraphQL playground. I would play around with my data there before I decide to put this query in an application. So you could just copy paste this one. Maybe we get rid of the description. And a nice way of working like this is you actually know what your data response looks like. So you could even just take this JSON without doing any data fetching and just build your UI on top of it. We could take this query, and then we can go to our application, and we can just insert this query here. And we're using Apollo client here. So we have some boilerplate we need to add, which is basically our URL endpoint like this. So we would need to make a connection with the GraphQL API, but we don't define what data we want from the GraphQL API just yet. That's something we do in our component. So we have one app component. I didn't make it look pretty. It's just a list that we're showing. But there's one case of synthetic sugar here that is the useQuery hook. So if you're using React, and from some of the Mentimeters earlier on, I saw some of you are, so that's good. But this also works with Apollo. If you work with Vue or any of the other cool JavaScript libraries or front-end frameworks, you can use all the synthetic sugar you like. So what I'm doing here, I'm posting my query, and then I'm letting this useQuery hook define what my data response will look like. And as you can see, it has an object it returns, which contains the data, and then I can just map over this data. So again, let's assume you're a junior front-end developer or you don't know GraphQL, and you step into a project and you're seeing this code. You probably think it's some sort of magic because you just have a hook and you just have a query and suddenly you will get data. I don't know if you ever looked at the network tab. You can actually do it from this tool as well. And also in this tool, we're seeing whenever we reload the data, we will have a request to our GraphQL API. And this request will look the same as the one that we had in our GraphQL playground. So again, we have a HTTP request to the GraphQL endpoint. We have a request method, which is a post. We have some request headers, such as the one to get JSON. Of course, we need to send our payload to it. So we would send our query, which is the one to get this post information. And then we could also send variables in case we would want to send these variables to the GraphQL API. And then its response will just be JSON again. So even though it looks like magic from your application, it is just HTTP. And I can actually show you that you don't really need to use a GraphQL client, although it could be very useful. Maybe some of you are using something called like a React query, or maybe you're using other ways to have state in your application that also handles data fetching. So in that case, we can see some of the synthetic sugar that's doing for you. Because if you would like to do the same with React, you probably need to create some state first. So you maybe have your, what do we have? We have posts. You would need to have a setter to set posts. And we would need to use a useState hook. So this is just a very default, very simple example. You probably need to set some default state. With GraphQL, you don't really have to do this. We probably also need to do a useEffect hook, like this. We probably need to check for value of post because we don't want to have an empty dependency array. So what we would do in the useEffect hook would just be an HTTP request because the GraphQL API is served over HTTP, so we don't want to do anything fancy there. So you could just type fetch, provide the endpoint, which is this one actually, and then insert it here. And then we probably need to set some headers as well, because maybe some of you paid attention. What type of headers do we need to set? Yes. So we need to set a content type header. And we would set this to application/JSON. And then probably we also need to set a body, which would be our GraphQL query. And in here we would... Sorry? Yeah, we can edit. I believe content type is sufficient, but it doesn't hurt to edit. And in here we can actually just add a string that is our GraphQL query. You can do it like this, probably break. So you probably need to use like template literals to do it, like this. And we probably need to set the method to post as well.
And body will have to be serialized.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, if we set the accept and content type, I believe we don't have to do this. But it wouldn't hurt. You can always do this. JSON.stringify, like this. Some parentheses somewhere here, maybe. Let me see. I usually use this trick of formatting the document. If it doesn't format, there's something wrong. And now it's probably better. Maybe it isn't. It should be here. Save this, see if we get any error. No, so this is all fine. So this is the fetch request, and I probably will also need to set some, we need to look at the promise, we need to serialize some things, so we can say response, we would want the JSON response, and then probably once we have the JSON response, we would want to set the JSON response to our state. Like this, formatted, it will look nicer. So this is some of the things that the GraphQL client is doing for you. But of course, you can just do it like this. You can have a use effect hook. You would need to do a fetch request. You would need to append all the things you need, like a body, like the correct headers. And then you need to actually write some code that defines what you will do with the output. So what are you going to do with the posts that were coming from the GraphQL API? So without the synthetic sugar of this use query, you actually need to write a lot of code. So this GraphQL client is really helping you in simplifying this. Because without it, it maybe is more painful to use GraphQL than just use a REST API. Although you do have the added benefit of not having to use separate endpoints, of trying to figure out what data will look like. But the GraphQL client will do all this for you. But if you know how to write this code, you can actually use GraphQL everywhere you want, because you're not tied to using it within this JavaScript setup where you can use Apollo client. You can actually take this fetch request, put it in React Query, put it in any sort of state manager that you have that is able to do requests to a HTTP endpoint. But of course, it's way much more work, and you also need to figure out what you do with the state, which typically I don't really like, and Apollo client is really helping me with this. But as a front-end developer interacting with the GraphQL API, you do get a sense of all this magic because you're not seeing the hard work that's going on underneath. We would go to our keynote there. So I would say we also demystified this one a bit because it's not all magic that you're seeing. You're using a GraphQL client, it makes your life easier. It takes away a lot of pain, but as a developer, it's important to understand that the tip of the iceberg is what you see, but what's going on underneath is something you really have to experience yourself. And I don't know about you, but usually I actually look at some of the code of the libraries I use to figure out what they're doing, because maybe at some point you will get deep inside this hole where you're debugging something and you actually need to know what the code looks like. And then probably you have a question like, is there no actual magic in GraphQL? Because you saw in the end it's just HTTP. As a front-end developer, you're making a request, you get some data back. That's all there is. And I would say it isn't, because it gives you control over the data. And it's what we saw in the beginning, right? You can do a query, you can do a different query, you can add fields, you can delete fields. And with GraphQL, you can even make, depending on how your API on the backend is being set up, you can even make requests to different data sources. Because maybe you want to combine data from one source with data from another source. So GraphQL gives you control over this data. Even though it's just an HTTP request you're sending, the body is where you will define the data sources you would like to retrieve. But the backend is doing the actual magic in making sure that the data will be collected from wherever it needs to be collected. But for you as a front-end developer, you will get that feeling of a magic because you get all the info you need in just one request. It also does something else I really like, which is giving you a type system. So for a REST API, you typically don't know what your data looks like before you send a request. With GraphQL, you can try out this request, maybe from the GraphQL playground. You can figure out the types that are being returned. But it also has this type system that you can actually introspect and use. So there are tools to help you figuring out what your schema looks like, and then create all the TypeScript types for you. So you don't have to do this by hand. You don't have to send a request and put this in your code manually. Instead, you can do it automatically. So even if some backend developer is changing some data in the GraphQL API, you can just rely on it being type safe. And most of all, it improves your developer experience. And for me, working in DevRel, trying to build cool tools for developer experience is the most important part, because if you don't have a great experience as a developer, there's a very high chance that you won't keep using this tool. You probably are going to search for something else that works. Unless there are no alternatives, then you're in this really cool zone where you just keep building a shitty UI, you keep building a shitty developer experience because people keep using your product because you're the only one. But luckily, we're quite spoiled. We've got a lot of different choices of tools we can use. So GraphQL is definitely something that will improve your developer experience. Not only because of the tool itself, but also of the surrounding ecosystem of tools people build onto the GraphQL specification. So what we discussed GraphQL, and what you're usually seeing is just the tip of the iceberg, and all the things you don't see are underneath. And there's a whole lot you can learn about building GraphQL APIs, making GraphQL performant, building GraphQL for multiple data sources. But as a front-end developer, you luckily don't have to care about it. But it is important to know that GraphQL usually is just an HTTP request, and whatever you define as a body will determine what data will be returned for you. So the magic is actually there, and not really at the front end, although you do get a cool developer experience, a type system, and control over the data. So that was my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. And well, we have time for questions, but also let's stay in touch, either online or well, for the rest of today. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Roy Derks. Some of the people backstage were saying that your talk is very, very effective. Like YouTube material. No, really, I think it was really well. The thing that impressed me that I liked, I don't know about you guys, this language of benefits. You're telling us, you're giving us something from the beginning, and you're always speaking about what it gives you. It gives you, it gives you. Many people approach the conversation from the side of solving problems, yes? So this idea that the GraphQL gives you something, it gives you this. I mean, I was very impressed by that. So thank you very much. Who has questions for Roy about GraphQL? We have a gentleman back there. Yeah, and we're watching. We see you, Arthur.
Maybe it's out of scope for this talk, but I had questions on creating the bottom part of the iceberg. Is that in scope, or?
Well, if you have a simple question, you can always ask him.
Are there best practices on handling access control when creating a GraphQL service?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe some of you wondered about this as well. So if you have a GraphQL request like we had here, probably your question is around this, like maybe you have a set of fields that's only for admins, and we don't really have this, so maybe it's the views, maybe it's the last updated ad. So in GraphQL, you don't really determine access based on the endpoints. You would determine on the fields in a query. And how GraphQL APIs typically work, you either handle authorization at the query level. So you could say you could only do this request if you have a valid authorization level. So maybe you use JWT tokens. Sometimes you also do it on the field level, which is a bit harder. So it really determines on the tools you're using to build in GraphQL. So it's really in the bottom part of the iceberg. You don't really see it as an end user. Although as an end user, you would make it clear which fields are available and which fields aren't. So if you want to make it easy for end users to discover which queries they can use and which they can't, I would typically say only do authorization at the top level, because you can add more descriptions there. You can actually add descriptions in here whenever you write your schema, so people can see they would need a valid token. But the best practice generally is to either only do it on the top level or do it down below as well, but it will take more fine-grained and a lot more imperative code in the GraphQL schema itself.
All right, any other question?
I have a question. So, for example, if you have some backend API, REST API, and you really wanted to try use GraphQL with it, is there some easy way to connect this API to GraphQL?
Yeah, there are multiple ways to do it. Well, like I said in the beginning, I like to build developer tools. One of the companies I'm working with is called StepZen. It's a service to build GraphQL APIs. And you could actually introspect the REST API and turn it into a GraphQL API to play with it. You could also build your own GraphQL schema. So when you build a GraphQL API, you would have all these queries. And for every query, you would need to define like a function to retrieve the data for you. So what you could easily do is create a function that goes to the REST API, takes the data, and then returns it. It's not the prettiest solution, but it is something you can probably build pretty easy.
About Swagger CodeGen, I'm sure you have heard about. So this is library generated from Swagger documentation, let's say. And for me, GraphQL is a very elastic way of accessing data. But my question is, do you think that GraphQL always you always benefit from switching to GraphQL, or it might be that sometimes it's good to have API client. It might be generated from the documentation if it's well maintained. And if you could elaborate on such a situation with condition if we have multiple customers using our API. Because for me, GraphQL looks like like Barry said, you advertise it like language of benefits, but for me it's so flexible that you might end up with different situations unexpected. So structured API or very elastic one, Fluent.
Yeah, indeed, like you said, like a REST API is typically like a contract. It's really structured. You have boundaries. In GraphQL, you actually do have the boundaries as well. So the person that creates the GraphQL API has control on the data you actually expose. So they can set the first boundaries, and then for you as the end user, you can make combinations, but only combinations allowed by the person creating the GraphQL API. So what you typically see is people would reduce the depth you could have. So maybe in theory, you could go infinitely deep here if people would allow it, but a lot of people that build GraphQL APIs don't allow you to go this deep. But most of all, I'd say GraphQL is really beneficial if you're building an internal tool, if you're building a consumer-focused product, if you're building a UI, and you want to have data for this UI that's flexible, and you don't want to rebuild an API every time you're going to build a new UI in your company. But if you're maybe building a public API that's being used by banks or maybe more traditional companies, they maybe don't want to have GraphQL. So that could be a consideration. Then again, there's many things you could do. So if you have a API gateway, for example, you could actually map the HTTP requests that you have in GraphQL. So you could say, HTTP request we saw for this query, it will have a body, it will have an endpoint you need to call, it will have a method, it will have some headers. In any API gateway, you could map this to a specific REST endpoint in your gateway and still have the same data available to any of the external parties you're working with. So it is kind of flexible, and flexibility is good, but it can also be bad, like you said. But yeah, you're still in control as the person that creates the actual GraphQL API. You just need to set the correct boundaries there.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, once more, GraphQL, not just, or just.
It's up to you to decide.
I'm still trying to figure that out. Anyway, Roy Derks, everybody. Give him a big hand for us. Thank you very much.